Do you think they accomplished what they were setting out to do, you think?
Yeah, well, it was a fabulous film, fabulous photography, of course, but the story was both accurate for Europe, but also remarkably similar to the story that has happened here. So one of the things that I do is to study the very long-term history of the New England landscape and actually Martha's Vineyard as well. And so starting with the glaciers, going through that very, very long period of forest cover, and then fairly rapidly clearing it and dominating it is exactly, of course, the same story here.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think I mentioned early on that the previous films that this team have made, like Wing Migration and Oceans, Microcosmos, and every film that they've made, technologically, they've been able to push the envelope to create special cameras, sound equipment to capture, nature and wildlife in a very naturalistic way. More so than anyone that I've ever seen. I mean, it just goes beyond. I mean, all that cinematography of the birds, for instance, that immediately brought me back to their landmark film, Wind Migration, where they were flying these little hyperplanes and had actually trained birds, had kind of raised birds so the birds would be very comfortable with the little hyperplanes. I forget what the exact terms are, but these little planes, they're not even planes, they're like go-karts with wings, and they fly right with the flock. They're actually flying up there, the cameras, with the flock, which is just amazing. And so, well, I was just curious, any questions offhand from the audience? Any
questions or comments?
Or comments, yeah. Or how did they do that? That kind of question. Yeah.
I had one, David.
Yeah.
A year ago when we were here, the technical experts on this film participated. And it's almost, they had done one scene, I remember Dr. Jesse Ozabel had said that they had done the wolf scene, and he got some of their audio and tech people explained how they actually did that, which was fascinating.
Do you remember?
They said they stopped at the butcher in the morning before a shoot, and they worked with them for 6 weeks. So they were very familiar with the group of wolves by the end of the film. Jacques Perrin said, you have to remember, it's a movie. So, because you think of this more as a nature documentary, when in fact this is a movie, and so there's there are a lot of special effects. Their special effects unit was highly advanced, but at the time they seemed to suggest that the movie they wanted to edit in this next year would be one that would sort of pick up where this movie ended and talk about how the landscape is being repopulated by bison.
Wow.
And that whole thing, it's interesting the way the final cut comes out. My question for David, where are we now in the New England landscape? We've seen deforestation. Your work has covered the arc of the regrowth of the New England forest, and we are beginning to see some of these kind of introductions of the big cats again up in northern New England, maybe even as far as Massachusetts.
Yeah, so it was interesting. Of course, the movie ends and tries to pull out at the very end a optimistic note of working with nature. What is missing actually relative to the eastern United States or the New England landscape and even substantial parts of Europe is the fact that agriculture has gone into decline in many parts of, certainly of the Northeast, and that has allowed tremendous forest areas to recover on Martha's Vineyard, across New England, across most of the eastern U.S. And so the landscape is actually becoming both more wooded, and people are becoming more receptive to wildlife. And that combination has allowed phenomenal recovery. So, yes, I mean, New England has seen a tremendous rebound, not just in nature in terms of vegetation, but in terms of wildlife. We have a thriving moose population in Massachusetts now. We have, of course, coyotes that have spread across the landscape. We have more cat, more kind of moderate-sized animals like beavers and bobcats and fisher cats and others. So there actually is reason for optimism, but it has to be coupled with exactly what they called for, which is an attempt to actually conserve and preserve nature intact. There are two things that are happening in a lot of landscapes. In this landscape, the vegetation, the whole nature of the habitats that are out there are wilder than they were 50 or 100 years ago. But as I said, people are also interacting with animals in a very different way. We're not persecuting them the way we were. Our hunting is much more controlled. And so these native species have actually, as they've come back, they've also entered more into our landscape. And so we're seeing, you know, cougars going into the suburbs of California. We're seeing bears going into the suburbs of Massachusetts. I mean, we've got a thriving bear population in Northampton, Massachusetts, for example. So these wild species are actually remarkably adaptable, much more so than we thought. And the story of deforestation and loss of those species, the loss came largely because the species were hunted out and persecuted. Deer, of course, wild boar, bison, they'll all live in an open landscape. Even wolves can live in an open landscape. But we have to have a accepting attitude.
That reminds me of the fact, what I was thinking about, we had a movie like 2-3 weeks ago called The Messenger about songbirds.
Yep.
And the bird population, songbirds especially, were almost devastated because of fashion. Fashion, people wanting to have feathers in their hats around the turn of the century. That was a huge, huge commerce. People killing birds for feathers for women's hats, and men's, but mostly women's hats. So, yes, you had a question.
It was one.
Actually, beautifully in this movie was the fact that when you change the habitat as much as people had, but through the cutting down of forests and especially the spread of agriculture, these big fields and grain fields and a variety of crops and so on, that actually, of course, is not a desert. That's a thriving landscape and habitat for a whole array of other bird species, small mammal species, insect species. And that is actually something which is really quite pertinent to the vineyard and to eastern North America. As the forests have come back, we've seen a major decline in grassland bird species, in a lot of butterfly species, other insects that need open landscapes. And among the highest conservation priorities on the vineyard is maintaining species that need open land, which is one of the reasons that there's a high priority for conserving those types of habitats, whether they're agricultural or whether they're just open grasslands and heathlands and shrublands like you find on the South Shore, you find out in Aquinnah. So those habitats are very important as forests are coming back to dominate. Of course, our old forests in Europe, right on the border of Poland and Russia, that still have thriving bison populations, have horse populations, have wild boar. And I don't believe any of this movie was filmed under those conditions, but that's what they're trying to capture. Major efforts. One is to increase the amount of forest area, but to do that by establishing forests of native species. Now, as forestry increased in Europe in the 20th century, it became very focused towards plantations of non-native species or single species. Right. And that was that photograph of the deer walking through what looked like a completely sterile
It looks like a
forest.
German forest with all the trees.
Yeah, exactly. So the EU is trying to shift forestry in a direction to increase the diversity of the forest and increase the range of native species. They were also getting at that point when they showed the great big old trees, the great big stumps, the fallen down trees, just to emphasize how important those are for habitat. And they're habitat for these strange insect species, but also you saw the wolves were denning in there and playing around on them. That's the other thing that they're trying to do in Europe now, is to increase the time in between harvesting episodes, logging episodes, to allow the trees to get much bigger. And then when they do cut the forest, to leave a substantial amount of trees intact so that they can get old and large. So, and because the EU is coordinated across all those countries, there's an effort, you know, in a diverse assortment of forests, from Turkey and Italy up to Scandinavia.
David, I have a question pertaining to state by state. Is there cooperation between various states? It sounds like obviously your sort of knowledge is broadly New England, but I'm just wondering, is there coordinated efforts between various states, especially bordering states, to work together in these efforts to reforest and rewild?
States are pretty idiosyncratic and pretty independent. The interesting thing in the eastern U.S. is that there has not been an effort to rewild. That is completely inadvertent. It came without any purposeful action. It came without people planting forests widely. It just came simply as a result of farmers decreasing the intensity of their effort and gradually reducing the extent of their harvested land, and forests just spreading naturally across them. And that's the story on the vineyard. The vast majority of the forests that we have either survived as woodlots through the 19th century or have come in on old abandoned fields and without any active planting or effort at all. So there isn't any need in the eastern U.S. for that type of cooperation. What's needed now is an effort to conserve what we have and not fragment it and parcel it up through selling of land and development of land.
Richard, this answers your question more than a question. Of course, the conflict between the wolves in Yellowstone and the ranchers just beyond Yellowstone persists, and so we kind of have conflicts everywhere.
Yeah, and coordinating across ownerships is challenging enough, let alone coordinating.
Right, across state borders.
This November, David led a Vineyard Conservation Society walk. We do those all monthly during the winter months. And I missed it, but I heard it was a great success, and it goes to this issue of old forests on this island, and we had an opportunity to go to parts of West Tisbury. I wonder if you could relate that story about the great oak.
Yeah, so later this summer, to talk about a map which was created in 1850 for the vineyard. And one of the fabulous aspects of this map is it shows all of the forested areas at that time. And that was the peak of agriculture. So we can use that map, and I've used it extensively, to go and search out all of those areas because those are the areas that came through this agricultural period without being cleared. And that's where the oldest trees on the island are found. And so we've pretty systematically gone through those. And there is an old forest that was known by other people before this, but the extent of it and the survival of it through the 19th century is very clear from this map. The biggest area and some of the nicest forests are on the property that's owned by Seven Gates Farm. And we took a hike out there and found some trees that are about 350 years old and getting close to the oldest age of those particular species of oak anywhere in the Northeast. Elsewhere on the island, we've found many trees that are in the 200 to 300 year age, and they're all in these old woodlots that were never cleared.
Any other questions, comments? No?
It was great.
Oh, okay. It was great. It was great, David. Thank you so much.